Hello my friends! Today at the Lulu Blue Studio we are going to paint something a little bit different. I've decided to create this branch with hanging fruits. These are persimmon fruits that are created in orange color. We are going to practice how to use the flat brush, the round brush. We are going to paint with the wet on wet technique, but also with the wet on dry technique to practice layers. Are you ready? Let's paint together. My name is Luisa and this is the Lulu Blue Studio. Let's start this tutorial. We start painting this botanical subject from the main element of this composition. And in particular, we are gonna take a round brush. This is a round brush in size 12. And I start to use just the tip of this brush to define the main branch that starts from the left part of this page and goes up to the upper, let's say, corner of this page. I'm using some burnt umber and at this moment is quite diluted to start to create the branch of this composition. The more water you will add to your pigment, the more your pigment will be light. And in this case, I'm starting to create the first layer of this branch in a very light color. Therefore, I'm using quite a lot of water to dilute the brown color of the burnt umber. While the first layer of brown is still wet, with the same brush I mixed a little bit of yellow ochre and I let it dry completely while the first layer is wet. On the yellow ochre I also add more concentrated burnt umber with the tip of my brush. And here I'm basically practicing some wet in wet technique to allow all of these colors and all of these layers to blend while all of the layers are still wet. This will allow all of these colors to blend together, and when the composition is going to be completely dry, you will not notice hard lines. At this point is really a practice of water control and playing with the right amount of pigment in order to obtain the right contrast of all of these colors. When you are playing with watercolor, another suggestion that I would like to give you is to remember that you can keep some white spaces. And this is what we are going to play with in this composition and what we have already highlighted, for example, on this brown branch, where in the lower part I still see some white coming from the paper. And at this point I change my brush and I'm using the flat brush from Princeton and I'm mixing on my color palette some Sap Green, a little bit of green earth, and I added also a little bit of brown. I'm using the flat brush and in particular I really like to use the belly of this brush to create the shape of these leaves. These leaves are created by pressing really on the paper the belly of this brush and then releasing the pressure while having on the paper just the side of this brush touching the paper. While the green is still wet, I have decided to add a little bit of orange and allow it to blend while the first layer of green is still wet. I've decided to add this orange, which is a transparent orange, because in a second moment I will start to create some persimmon fruits, and I know that these fruits are in orange color. Therefore, there is going to be a sort of connection between the leaves and the fruits in this composition. If you don't have a flat brush available, you can still create these leaves, for example with a round brush that can be the same brush that you have used to create the branch of this composition. And at this point I take a round brush in size 6 and I start to create the fruits, these persimmon fruits that are in orange color, and therefore I take from my color palette some transparent orange and I create a round shape where I created the leaves of this fruit. I take a quite concentrated amount of transparent orange. It means that I have just a little bit of water and a high concentration of pigment. I've also allowed a little bit of Scarlet Red to blend into the orange first layer of this fruit. And when I'm quite happy with the shape of this fruit and with the overall composition so far, I use the same brush to start to create some small branches that are giving a little bit more density in the upper part of this painting. Throughout this tutorial, I really encourage you to play with the wet on wet technique and allow yourself to have on your brush different concentrations of pigments and different amounts of water. In this way, you will learn by doing, by practicing these leaves and these branches and these fruits, how much water you need to have on your brush and on the paper in order to obtain a consistent layer of color. If you are a beginner, don't get discouraged if in first place you are not able to get the perfect ratio between water and color. Remember, for example, that if you have laid onto your page too much water and pigment on your composition, you can always remove the puddle of water just by soaking the water with a dry brush. So in most of the cases you can always optimize something that maybe you have created on the page and that is not optimal. So your technique can improve by practicing these brush strokes also on compositions like this one. Also, if you are a beginner, remember that you can always download for free the Beginner's Guide to Watercolor Flower Painting, which is an ebook that I wrote for all of the beginners that contains information about watercolor painting, in particular flower painting, techniques, supplies to use, and also how to paint easy flowers. You can download for free this guide by clicking on the link in the description down below. Also, if you like this video, please press like and subscribe to this channel because it really helps me to create content for you to watch for free. When I am satisfied with the amount of elements in the upper part of this composition, I start to create more fruits more in the center part of this painting. And therefore I use my round brush in size 6 to keep creating these persimmon fruits. The persimmon fruits are creating using transparent orange in a first layer quite light, and I also add a little bit of Scarlet Red to blend while the orange is still wet. In this case, I'm creating some fruits that are really touching each other, they are next to each other, and therefore in this case I want to play with the different color values. Some persimmons, in particular the persimmon that is the first persimmon I've created, is more concentrated in color, while the one that I've created in the upper part of the page that is touching the first one is a little bit lighter. This means that I've used less pigment with a higher concentration of water, and I am allowing them to touch in order for some orange and red to blend among these two shapes. The third persimmon I am creating in this moment is quite concentrated, and I like it to have it quite dark because it's not touching any of the two persimmons that I've created beforehand in this composition. I really like to see how orange and brown are blending together, and therefore using just the tip of this round brush I start to create a very fine branch that connects these three persimmons, and I really like to create it in this moment because the orange color is still wet and it will allow the brown and orange to blend together. I keep adding branches where I imagine some leaves are going to be created, and at this point, really using my flat brush, I go back to add these green elements. The first layer of these leaves is very light. I will add more brush strokes in a second moment. And I really like to create a connection between the leaves and the orange elements by creating a sort of green that is a little bit more muted by adding a little bit of transparent orange into the mixture. This means that in order to create this green, I'm mixing a little bit of Sap Green and green earth with a very little touch of transparent orange. You can add this transparent orange on your color palette and mix it together with the green, or you can allow the transparent orange to mix directly onto the paper. You will obtain two different effects, and it's up to you to decide which effect you want to achieve on your compositions. At this point, I saw that these leaves were still quite light, and therefore I took a little bit of Sap Green, quite concentrated, and I allowed this bright green to blend into these leaves. Since the lower part of this page is still empty, I have decided to lead the eyes of the observer to the bottom part of this page by creating more branches and adding more leaves and a persimmon fruit. And so I'm creating these branches using a little bit of burnt umber and just the tip of my brush, and I'm creating some branches that are in some parts thicker compared to others. I mix a little bit of transparent orange with green earth and a little bit of Sap Green to start to create these big leaves in the lower part of this composition. The first layer is quite light. When you are working in watercolor and when you are painting in watercolor, many people will suggest to start painting layers from the lighter layer into the darker layer, and this is a technique that we are using in this composition as well. At this point, I really like the idea to create a persimmon fruit that is really tucked under this green leaf, and therefore I take this round brush and I add a few brush strokes to create this fruit underneath this green element. This orange fruit has a quite concentrated transparent orange, and I left a little bit of white, so white coming from the paper, between the leaf and the orange fruit. And at this point I take my flat brush and I keep adding a few green elements in this composition. I really like to add another big leaf in the bottom part of this composition because I really think that a big element in this part is missing. I mix a little bit of green earth and Sap Green with some transparent orange, and then taking my round brush in size 6, I add a concentrated amount of burnt umber into these leaves that are still wet. These will create beautiful blending effects because these leaves are really still wet and they have just been created, and therefore the brown, the more concentrated brown, is going to blend beautifully into the green first layer. And with this same brush I keep adding a few brush strokes in brown color to add a few branches in the lower part of this composition. And then I noticed that in this part, in the center and beginner part of this branch, there is quite a heavy amount of white space, and therefore I've decided to add even here some brown elements. These branches are very thin and they are created not adding a lot of pressure onto the page, but just touching the paper with the tip of my brush. You can keep refining your composition and add as many brown elements as you wish, considering the effect that you want to achieve. At this point, I let the whole composition dry before adding details. When the composition is completely dry, I take back my flat brush and I mix on my color palette some green earth to start to add some little elements, green elements. So these are leaves on the branches I've created just a few moments ago. I suggest you to wait to proceed with your composition because I would like to add a few elements through the wet on dry technique. So I wanted to add basically layers, and in order to do so, I prefer that all of the layers, the first layers that I've created up until now, are completely dry. Therefore, I've used a hairdryer to speed up the process of drying of this painting. You can either use the same method or you can just wait for this painting to dry naturally. And when the painting is completely dry, I take my round brush from Silver Black Velvet. This is the brush I own that has the thinnest tip. And therefore, with a little bit of black, I create this fine dot in the bottom part of each fruit. Then, with this same brush, I start to add layers onto the leaves. I really like this moment because I find it very relaxing, and I also like it because it allows me to add a few brush strokes that really make this painting my own, to add, let's say, my own touch to this watercolor painting. And therefore, if you like to add layers, you can follow my instruction and you can add layers to these leaves in the way I am doing. I want these layers on the leaves to be of the same color tone as the leaves, the first layer of the leaves that I've created, and therefore I create these veins on the leaves just by mixing some Sap Green and Cobalt Green dark with some transparent orange. This will create a very muted type of green, quite dark, that really fits well the composition because also the leaves I created using similar colors. To create these layers, I'm keeping my hand very light and I'm adding these brush strokes just using the tip of my brush. And when I look at the composition, I'm really happy with this result. I really hope you enjoy it. Thank you for watching this tutorial.